So I wanted to go into robotics primarily um, at middle school. So I was influenced by TV and action heroes and science fiction. And when I was in middle school, I saw this one show called The Bionic Woman. And I wanted to build a bionic woman. So in order to do that, I had to be a scientist, had to be an engineer. So that was my goal in life, was to build a bionic woman. And that was my original influence in terms of joining the scientific ranks.
I don't call myself a scientist. I describe myself as, I'm trained, I'm an engineer by training, but a scientist at heart. So, because I say that because I'm just naturally curious. And, when I was 10, I had my own little lab and I used to do all these experiments and take things apart. And, my parents described it that he's doing konkaka, which is onomatopoeia. It's the sound that you make with a hammer, right? So they would say he's doing his konkaka. I just, enjoyed figuring stuff out and kind of autodidact, self-taught, so forth. Because I really, this is why I say I'm a scientist at heart. I wanted to really understand the fundamental reason for what was going on.
I grew up in an area in the British Isles in the Lake District. It was a wonderful area for a child to grow up in because it was an area where there were lots of fossils. It had a lot of unusual plants. It was an area of limestone with a lot of unusual plants. And also, my mother particularly was very interested in biology. She wasn't a biologist, but she knew a lot and she stimulated me a lot. So I knew from the very beginning that that's what I was most interested in. And then my father was a medical doctor, and I remember him impressing me very early on. He talked about how, well, every human was different, but I also could see that in all the species I was looking at, that there was terrific variation. So very early on, I was interested in why was there so much variation, what was it maintaining it? And this led into my interest in genetics, which then led into the interest of how did speciation occur.
My interest in biology started very, very early. As a little boy catching butterflies and looking at birds and so forth. And that continued all the way through teens and up into undergraduate times. But I didn't know I was going to become a professional biologist until I started graduate work. And I assisted in my first year a teacher teaching in the laboratory. And I thought, my goodness, there's teaching that can be done in association with research that I was about to embark on, and there's a career for that, and they pay you for it. That's for me.
Why did I become a scientist? Actually, after high school, I wasn't necessarily going to go to college. So I was working for a whole number of years at a lot of different odd jobs. And I found myself working for a seismology company in Montana. And I got to talking to the geologists, the real geologist on site. And that's what got me interested in geology. And I also knew, and this isn't the most noble motivation, that they were making a lot of money and I wasn't. And so I decided, okay, I need to go back to university or go to university and learn something and become an oil geologist and make a pile of money. Of course, once I got to university, I discovered that I wasn't interested in that at all, but I was interested in igneous rocks and the deep earth. And so my career took a different path than what I expected.
It was very gradual. I mean, as a kid, for reasons I cannot explain to you, okay, I got very involved with gadgets and electronics. I had a remarkable thing happen to me because I grew up in New York at the end of the war. So there's a part of New York where a lot of the war surplus stuff got delivered. I mean, transformers, capacitors, vacuum tubes, you name it. Pieces of electronics you could buy for $1. You could buy a radar set. You know, it was unbelievable what you could do. And I started making hi-fi stuff. The problem I had, you put your needle in the record, it made a terrible hissing noise, like that all the time. And it wouldn't bother you if the music was loud. Like, for example, the first movement of a Beethoven sonata was loud and fast. So the record scratch didn't bother you. But in the slow movement, that's all you heard. I tried to make filters that cut the high frequencies, but then when the music was loud, opened the bandwidth up again so you heard the full glory of the signal. And everything I made was worse than the record scratch. I mean, you hear, things like that, And so I had to go to school. And that's what made me decided that I should go to college. And so I got an MIT. Don't ask me how that happened, but okay. And I started as an electrical engineer for that reason. And that's when I got disappointed terribly that they wouldn't let me talk to the faculty or get to talk to somebody who knew enough about this. I had to learn all sorts of stuff first. And that's when I went into physics.
I have some friends who decided to become a scientist at later ages, and it was a deliberative process. I can't remember a time when I wasn't going to be a scientist, quite honestly, okay? Or at least something that was scientifically oriented. My dad was a doctor, and a small-town doctor, actually. And so I was brought up in kind of a household that was oriented towards scientific things. But I also grew up in the 1950s and 1960s, and in that era, we were just so aware of science. Everyone in the public was so aware of the foundational importance of science. On the negative side or the fearful side, we lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. We saw the development of the atomic bomb, and unfortunately, its deployment. On the positive side, we saw the development of nuclear power. We saw the development of the transistor, electronics. All this happened in a very short order. And so you could not grow up in that era if you were at all aware. In that sort of an era, you sort of always, my friends and I, and almost everyone I knew, at least was aware of science, and it was something that was considered a very high calling.
I'm not sure I ever made a decision, but I was certainly attracted to science from a very early age from two completely different angles. One was I grew up on the mud flats in my backyard in Florida, and I was just fascinated by stomping around in the echinoderms and the mollusks and fish and so forth, figuring that out. And then for the other side, a highly technological end, much less natural, was sort of computers, robots, as I saw them presented to me by Disney, and animatronics, meaning, and then my father's doctor's paraphernalia. So these are all very technical and artificial versus the natural of the mud flats. And so I was constantly trying to, that was around when I was 10, I wanted to see if I could make something that would use all of those somehow.
So when I think back about why I decided to become a scientist, it's actually odd. Most people will say, I had this amazing science teacher in 6th grade. I had this amazing science teacher in high school. And so for me, it's a little bit different. When I was going through high school, it felt pretty easy to me. I did well in the classes. And it got to a point where I expected to do well. I expected to get 100% on this or that. And one day I got a science test back and I got one wrong. And the question was, I'll remember it to this day, because Jane and Mike have 9 children, they're all boys. Jane is pregnant again, and what are the chances that she's going to have a boy versus a girl? And I, of course, put down something 10%, and of course the answer was 50-50, because every event is independent. And I got it wrong, and I was furious. I was so angry. And then I realized I found something really challenging. And it was literally that test and that experience that told me, not only am I going to be a scientist, I'm going to be a geneticist. And I'm going to answer these kinds of questions. And this is what I'm going to do with my life. And I did.
So when I decided to become a scientist, it's a big of a complicated question with an answer that is bringing me back to my family origins. And I think there is a mix of two things. One, which is a true fascination for many things. I've always been very curious, and also I've been curious about the universe, stars, planets, galaxies, etc. And I was born the year of Sputnik, and so everything which had to do with space exploration had my great interest. And I still remember that I was taken aback when I saw the first image of the Earth taken from the moon, and that amazement never left me somehow. The other reason is that I was born in a family of artists, of musicians, and that's what I normally should have done, but then I reacted strongly for all sort of reasons and decided to do what I was the least, I think, good at, and that is physics. And then it was a series of good encounters, and also I enjoyed what I was doing, and I still enjoy it.
I took a bit of a strange career path. My first degree is in applied economics, and I worked in investment banking for 2 years after college before chucking it all to go to grad school in volcanology. And the short version of the story of how that happened is that basically I discovered geology and specifically volcanology fairly late in my college career, and I really wanted to finish out my degree and give finance a shot before I made this change. But after a few years working in banking, I kind of hit a fork in the road and decided that I was going to take this risk, and it was one of the best decisions I ever made.